I want to do something a bit different today than we did last time. I think I kind of prefaced this last time, but so when Lynn and I first spoke, I don't know, about a year ago, about what would be useful for me to come talk about. The original question was sort of why, I think it was, why did the founders decide to make the United States a republic? And there's a factual answer to, there's a fact-like answer to that. We talked about that last time. I think my overall hope for this 3 hours that we get together was to spend the first half talking about why the rules got written the way that they did, and to think about some of the arguments and the sensibilities of what counted as normal for people who were making the rules, and also to be thinking about some of the sort of cultural context in which those rules got momentum and some of those mores got incubated and developed. So that it's not just a matter of this is what the rules say and that's why. How it works this way, it was also sort of this is the sort of more normative baggage that we've inherited in a lot of ways. What I want to do today is think a lot more explicitly about why that matters, how it matters for us as people now, as people engaging and participating in different ways. So the how it matters for us was very much in the subtext last time, in part because we're talking about stuff that's hundreds of years old, but in part also just by virtue of the fact that we're talking about systems and structures. So what I've done is picked a few comparatively brief political statements from the sort of mid to late 20th century that I think are really interesting vehicles for what was going on at a particular time, but also that are making arguments in a way that I want to sort of disassemble and think about in ways that are, I think, germane well beyond that specific historical moment. But so really briefly, I also want to go back and recap last time. See where we were. We had talked about the Mayflower Compact, which is this really brief statement of which a lot more people have heard than have actually read or I think thought much about. And the whole point of that I wanted to have in front of us was that this is an example of what a person in my industry would call social contract, as essentially people founding for themselves a plan to go forward. And we talked about the ins and outs of saying, hey, we speak the same language, we have some things in common, let's agree now to, in the far future, follow the rules that we ourselves will make for ourselves in the near future. So that even if we don't fully agree with them, we need to create some sort of order. We need some sort of clarity, stability, expectation to follow through. So that was just to get that on the table. It's one example of many that do that, but that's what I had hoped we would talk about. And then we talked a lot about the Federalist Papers, specifically the 10th one. And the reason I wanted to talk about that was, A, it's a pretty cogent answer to why the United States got ultimately the winning argument. The argument that went out was, this is why we have been made the sort of republic that we are. The kind of crude version of that answer is that if you have a strong central government, it will in the long run be less corruptible and more stable than having more diffuse, smaller, more local governments. It's not an airtight argument, and I'm grossly oversimplifying it, but that's essentially what the number 10 is saying. And the other thing that's interesting about that, I think, is that Federalist number 10 is this fundamentally pragmatic text saying we're already a big country, we're going to be bigger, and you can't have this many people in one place without disagreements popping up. He talked a lot about faction, talked a lot about social structures and people probably going to be inclined to want to advocate for themselves in what could be understood as a destabilizing sort of tendency. So he's being very pragmatic in saying we can't just all have local county sheriffs running everything because they'll be easier to corrupt. Everything will be less coherent, everything will be less stable. At the same time, it's this deeply utopian argument, I think, that's in a sense saying as long as we write the rules correctly, we can more or less count on the better nature of the people participating in that system to give it the substance that will really protect the ideals for which we fought this revolution and established this country in the first place. So he's got that passage about how if you have people elected from a large enough electorate, they will not be corruptible, and they won't be inclined to the corrupt things that they would have done if they had a smaller electorate. I think that's self-evidently dated as arguments go. That hasn't worked as well. I think we can pretty compellingly say as well as he had hoped, but that's the crux of it. And we didn't talk about, I want to come back to the Federalist paper as the segue to today. We did not talk as much about the Lincoln text. I mentioned it very briefly, but I had given you the text, his second inaugural, and a letter to Horace Greeley. There's a key distinction in there. This is one of the moments where he says, about as succinctly as you can, that at least early in the war, he's saying very publicly, I'm fighting this war to save the Union. Slavery is a side issue that is not driving these decisions. So that's the standard. If I can win this war and not free a single slave, I'll do that. And if I can free all the slaves and still lose the war, I'm not doing that. There's an interesting part at the very end of that letter that I think is the key, which is that this is my legal duty. It's not my personal ethical commitment. I am the president. I am driven by my legal constraints, not by my personal values. And I'm paraphrasing, I think that's probably somewhat an oversimplification, but I want that in our memories of this is a person saying that there are some ideals that still govern us. A lot of people would refer to the Civil War as sort of a second founding, right? The country that we occupy is a fundamentally different one than the one that elected in the fall of 1860. To state the obvious. But I think that distinction between this is what I personally think and want and would support, and this is what I think would be a better world over here in a separate hand from this is what the rules say that I'm supposed to do. And then he talked, and I think that gets elaborated more in the second inaugural, once the war is pretty much over, saying this isn't about personal retribution. There's some political savvy there. I think that one of the dominant historical understandings would be that, or arguments would be that had Lincoln not died, that Reconstruction would have likely been less punitive and more sustained. And one of the outcomes of his assassination was that it started out more punitive, and then the southern states felt so aggrieved subsequent to that they, in a backdoor deal to let the Republicans have their president, got Reconstruction to end. So that what you have is the sense that Lincoln would have been better after the war than certainly Johnson and then Grant and then the guy after Grant. Yeah.
We know it's a guy.
There. And he was white, yeah. And he had a beard. But so I want that is a really crucial, that it's an author. It's a really key dynamic there of a president saying, I believe these things very strongly, but they're not relevant to my job over here. There's an echo of that through to the late 20th century where Jimmy Carter very publicly, very personally pro-life. And very publicly and politically supportive of Roe and the Warren Court that had generated that. There's an echo of that. This isn't just a moment in history, but I think that's a dynamic that we're talking about here is people in positions of leadership making decisions between what they think is good and what the system requires. And that's what I wanted to go back to.
Yeah, but aren't they supposed to be making decisions based on their constituents? And then what's good for the country or what's good for the state or what's good for the county?
So that is excellent segue, but thank you for asking that. That was a rhetorical question?
Yeah,
Okay.
sort of.
So
I've always felt that politicians are supposed to be representing their people, but unfortunately, the way our political system seems to work now, they spend all their time trying to get money to get reelected instead of doing what their constituents want them to do.
So I'll come back to that, I promise. I would suggest that those are two different things. One is the extent to which any elected leader in our system is supposed to be foregrounded some nominal sort of public good, public will.
Yeah.
To which I would ask a similar rhetorical question: what we do when all the people seem to be real bad at agreeing on what that looks like. And it's not like we could just go to the library and look up what the public will is and what's good right now. So I think that the question of leadership is necessarily one of judgment, but also one in which that judgment is literally a decision. It's not identifying a correct answer, it's making.
Well, and presumably, somebody in that sort of position has more information than we have about, the factual information to make a decision.
Well, and presumably that is an argument. I mean, there's also an argument out there, certainly, that we elect people. And I don't know if you remember, there's this one thing that we talked about that with the Federalist paper where they talk about representatives as delegates. As opposed to what some people might say, as opposed to representatives as trustees. So it's a fine line distinction, but if I'm electing a representative to be my delegate, I'm basically saying this is the vote that I'm, like, I trust you to agree with me and do that, which is different from you're my trustee. I trust your judgment. You go make a good decision.
So that's really the difference between the House of Representatives and the Senate.
You could make that argument. I think it's a powerful argument that the Senate was supposed to go more deliberative. That's why you have balance and size between the states. That's why until 1932, they were not elected by the public. They were elected by state houses.
I think too, at least those in the executive department, including the president, they swear to support the Constitution and support the domestic. So that comes first before those personal judgments, I think. Right?
It should. Yes. It should.
And I think that it.
And if I can follow up too, I think sometimes I use an example of Dwight Eisenhower before D-Day or some other folks. Sometimes tough, great leaders have got to make really challenging decisions. Sometimes, like in Lincoln's case, he had made a choice between preserving the Union and, bowing to his personal beliefs. Or in your case with Jimmy Carter too, he had some deep Christian beliefs that were contrary to what he related to as president of the United States.
I mean, one of the things that I want to talk about today is a long-standing and I think really useful. I'm going to call it a paradox. Useful thing to remember when we're trying to make sense of these things, which is the extent to which you're never going to get the decision and the judgment that the decision implies. You're never going to get the decision out of politics. That the more important a question is, the less answerable by fact it's probably going to be. It just is an empirical observation. That if by the time we have a question that seems important and high stakes, there's got to be a strong correlation between that and the fact that it can't just be answered by more research. Because if you can answer with more research or looking through another microscope or another telescope, it wouldn't have escalated to the point of having been an interesting complicated question. So virtually by definition, when we talk about big P politics, we are talking about judgment and uncertainty and vagary and the need for back and forth. And I'm making an assertion there. I don't think that that's fully 100% always a governing reality, but I think it's useful to remember. Try to sense. So for today, we read a campaign speech from RFK Sr. We read, or we will talk about rather, get my teacher speak out of my head. I want to talk about something that Robert F. Kennedy Sr. said in University of Kansas in 1968, Dr. King's letter from the Birmingham City Jail earlier the same decade, and the Moynihan Report, which was rooted in some work that he had done in the middle of the 1960s, but was produced for the new Nixon administration for whom he was working, and I want to talk about some more context in each of those. The fourth thing, there's I think, what's one of my favorite articles, but the Jack Zeitz is a phenomenally a folklorist, he's an academic. The fourth thing that I put in there is the civilizing mission of the Walt Disney Company. It's a really interesting argument. I'm just going to say this now, I'll come back to it later if we have time. Talking about how something seemingly as banal and apolitical as the Walt Disney apparatus is something that can be seen as having profoundly deep political relevance in terms of how we understand our world, how we interact with each other, how what we count as normal has been made and produced elsewhere. That's why that's something we'll come back to. But so to frame what I want to talk about today is to go back where we left with the Federalist Papers. And I think that there were two key points. One, for which I have largely no answer, is the reality that, and I did again, I'm not aloof to the reality. There are no female identified authors in here. There were no founding mothers in the same way that we understand founding fathers. Gender exclusion, racial exclusion, economic exclusion are all huge themes that are incredibly important, that are worth their own class. And I don't want to disserve them, but we didn't talk when we read the Federalist paper about where the women were, other than to say he's not talking about them. So I want to acknowledge that I am in some sense reversing that challenge by also not bringing that in. But the other thing we talked about, just in a structural sense, is James Madison and the others writing these things were saying, if you write the rules this way, this is the pragmatists in the utopia, if you write the rules this way, it'll protect the rights that we fought for. And this is how we're going to protect justice. He's not talking about what individuals do. They're not talking about what rights individuals have to do things or to not be forced to do other things. They are silent. They're largely silent of what it means to be a citizen, what a citizen is entitled to do, and what a citizen is empowered to do, which is kind of the segue that I wanted to have for today. Trina.
Bill has made a comment. I used the links in the email to have the documents ready to view. The Moynihan one did not work. I found a copy on a quick search. Okay, so he's good.
Okay,
I think he was just informing me.
Okay.
I just realized.
Good, I'm glad you got it.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention.
Thanks, yeah. The one that I had was from the New York Times archive, and I think that their property rights, something, probably for very good reason, made it hard to just give it to other people. Yeah, oh my gosh.
Yeah,
That's really small.
not that, but here's the beginning of each column. Here's the middle of each column, and the end of each column is cut off.
Okay, well, I'll tell everybody about what Ann said, aware, that's only marginally bigger.
Much bigger.
There's one, I mean, there are a lot of things that I think are interesting that I would hope you could have a chance to take away from this, but I think there's one overarching question that I want to offer up for you to be juggling for yourself. I can't do that evidently. I'll format it on a little paper next time. Think about what citizenship means to you. When you think of citizenship, what is that for you? What do you want it to be? And what is that feeling somehow ethically or practically obligated to do for yourself? The conceit there is that I'm saying that this isn't actually a civics class. I'm not going to give you a list and say that this is the the definition, if you do 6 of these 8 things, at least twice a year, you're a good citizen. I don't believe that. I think that there are lots of ways of understanding each of us as part of various larger wholes. And I think it's probably most useful to have a conversation like this where we can have that in our brain, hear from each other about where that leaves us, use that as sort of the motivating force when we're trying to figure out what's going on in these different texts. So I have other questions, but I want to have that in your mind of when you think of what it means to be a citizen, you're probably setting some expectation. It's an evaluative category, by definition, other than a very strictly legal sense of do you have a passport? If you think about what that entails, what does that mean that you feel obligated and committed to do? What are your standards? So voting, that's a common one.
That's my first, and be aware of the issues, do research on both sides, understand.
And so that's not a common, can you say why? What's the connection between voting and being a good citizen?
Reading. Well, I think coming to your own conclusion based on what you believe rather than what somebody tells you to believe that, but I don't know that you would consider that a good citizen, but
I'm going to become a broken record. I maybe I don't. I'm going to joke. I personally agree with that, but also I think that it's possible where someone says that to be a good citizen is to not vote. And I could play that devil's advocacy as well. But so I agree. I'm sorry. You have that. And I just want to come back. So it sounds like contributing your own brain judgment, thought to the overall decision being made. Like it's a way. Your vote is a contribution to something else.
well,
Is that?
yeah, but if you don't vote, then you don't really have any reason to complain about where we're going.
But I'm saying the person is complaining, but I'm saying is you have the right to vote or not vote. It's a conscious decision. Go either way. It shouldn't be.
And the way we vote now, it's strictly binary,
Right.
So
If you
you may
don't-
be somewhere in between
Exactly.
those choices, but you're not able to make that choice. Because you either have to vote Democrat or.
But you have the right in an option. You have the right in an option.
Yeah, but that
It
doesn't
doesn't
work.
Well, I didn't say a word.
But I know, I'm not talking about a right. I'm talking about being able to express what you feel and what, voting just doesn't give you the choice to reflect how you feel and what you want to expect of government.
And that's the way our voting system is set up because, we don't have additional parties that can get on a ballot.
What
in
about
most
ranked
states.
choice?
In all states, so, yeah, that's what I mean.
And we have been unlawfully decertified in the state.
Well, I want to make two. Sorry.
I was going to say that somebody commented that for not voting for one, that for a Democrat or Republic is not even a choice, but there have been some elections where a third party, Ross Perot, for example, garnered so many votes away from the Democrats that the Republicans.
He's often credited. Some people suggest that he took enough votes away from George H.W. Bush
That was
to tip the electoral vote, the electoral college vote to Bill Clinton.
Yeah, so, I mean, it does, but we don't always have a third party that gets to that level. He got like 30%, I think, of the vote.
Was it
18? 19.
And in key states, right? So, and so voting is obviously. I want to rate it. We'll come back to. Yes.
How does ranked choice voting affect that?
So I want to come back to that.
Okay.
But what I wanted to say is that voting obviously is a thing about which there are lots of feelings to be had, investments to be had. We all immediately went from citizen to participating in large scale politics.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I would encourage us to realize that's not the only thing that word means. There's an argument out there to be made that to be a citizen is to engage in on-the-ground super local politics. I said this very early the last time, but to come back to it, if politics is fundamentally a question of us engaging with difference and grappling with uncertainty and experiencing other people's sensibilities as they differ from ours, then large-scale party-based politics, quote unquote, are one of the least political things around because it's all about known arguments and money and transparency and trade-offs and binaries. Not that, and I wouldn't fully discuss this, but I think there's a powerful argument out there, which is that maybe citizen for someone means getting together and talking about political ideas and learning things. It might be going to the Rotary. It might be your church. Like, these are all different forms of citizenship of what it means to belong to a larger community or a larger structure. So I want to make sure that we're pushing out as far as we can on the boundary of what is relevant and germane to the question of citizenship. Yes.
I think there's another variable there that we're being faced with, and that is many ways, at least for me personally, I'm finding that I'm becoming a cosmic orphan because of the global pressure on us now. I'm a citizen, but I see the culture. Economically, we are global, whether we like it or not. There's so many variables. I think that definition that we sucked at least the generation behind us is really going to struggle with. What does it mean to be a citizen when they start thinking from that global perspective more? That's just an idea that I could living across.
So the idea of citizenship changes by generation.
I think whether we like it or not, I think it's going to happen.
I would suggest, so that seems compelling to me. I would suggest that we all have similar, but in crucial ways, different definitions of it already. And that to the extent that our definition of citizenship is the thing that creates for us the expectations of this is what it means to be a good citizen, if our endpoints are all going this way, then our question of what we're obligated to do is this array of vectors pointing in different directions. We don't all agree that there are 7 things that make a good citizen. I would suggest that that's a good thing. But it introduces more instability, for sure. I wanted to come back briefly to the question of ranked choice voting in other ways. I guess I'll try and do this adequate justice, but the general argument, the conventional argument about the party system in the United States and the electoral dynamics in the United States is conventionally that going back to the Constitution, that this is how, in order to win an election in this country, you need to have more votes than anybody else, which mathematically predisposes us to having only 2 teams. That the fact that we have 2 viable parties is a direct logical effect of the way in which our election laws work. Yes.
Just a question about democracy. Are we the only democracy that has a 2-party system?
There are lots of places that are functional 2-party systems. The UK is
So
functional.
it's smaller nations?
Canada is functional. I mean, former Commonwealth countries are some of those. I mean, the Liberal Democrats have not been a viable electoral entity in the United Kingdom since the 40s.
That's a question.
Yeah. I think that one of the interesting things about ranked choice voting, right, which is this idea that functionally everyone goes to the poll once, but you give them a bunch of different ballots, I'm paraphrasing it, but you're basically saying, here's how I would vote if you made me keep coming back. So if my first person doesn't win, you now know what I would say if I did come back, so that they can keep counting ballots until they come up with something. Because one of the arguments that comes out of, and we were shadowing of it, the fact that we have a by and large duopoly of American institutional politics, the Democratic and Republican parties, is that it's disaffecting and it's a disincentive to participate. And then by tweaking the rules that govern our participation, it actually facilitates our re-engagement with it. So I think that there is a strong argument out there that we can work within our system to find ways, if that's a thing we want to do. Am I addressing your question? At least I do.
I think the electoral college negates that.
I think it does.
And,
Listen,
and that's,
Very much.
but that, yeah, we're not talking about that.
If I could address California.
We can. Yes, go ahead.
We were in California when we all decided on ranked choice. That was a decade, almost 2 decades ago. And what has happened in this subsequent 2 decades is that it has
Kind of
made
one party.
it's created a one-party state. What that practical application of it is disenfranchised about 75% of the counties in California. So if you're candidates from Marin County down to Los Angeles County, and you win the votes there, which means the majority of the populace, the folks in Kern County or Montecito or all those other places, their votes don't count.
Marginalized.
So, yes,
And so I feel strongly about that because that kind of gets away from whether we're a 2-party or multiple party country.
yeah, and I would encourage, so this is one of the ways in which Federalist 10 is a really important text to remember, because even aside from saying specifically, it is, I think, a really good example of what it means to be sober-minded and realistic, and think about how you can tweak suboptimal rules in what might be a less than desirable societal structure to get at least close and mostly reliably close to where we want to end up. Because the 2-party system isn't the end, right? The 2-party system has become a more or less violent means toward an end, which is giving enough people a mechanism and an avenue by which to participate in politics. It has become less good at that. It's become less suitable. But just preserving the 2-party system as the 2-party system doesn't get us in. It might accidentally, it might give us more choice. And I think that's not fair for you, Bob, is that 2 parties gives you 2 choices. And if you lose one of the choices. But it's the choice that we want. It's not the party. It should be, I think most people would say that they don't care what the party, if you could go in to a booth and actually have choices to make and different policy options and different ideals encapsulated in these candidates and different sorts of political speech to make, the partisanship is ancillary to that. I think would be one of the key arguments. But yeah, so that's one of the reasons I wanted to start with the Federalist question was because it is grappling very much with what's going on there, right? And to go back to the Electoral College, the Electoral College, I think, is yes, it's potentially a distraction. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I think it's relevant. So I think that
Well, it's relevant because it's the way each state can be represented.
but thematically, I think there's a thematic parallel.
It's like
Basically,
Senate versus.
it preserves an avenue for participation for giant swaths of the electorate that would, in practical terms, otherwise be excluded. If this was just a straight popular vote country,
California.
then it's probably plausible to say that the overwhelming majority of political ad spending would be within 45 minutes of the coasts. So the Electoral College forces people to go to Wyoming and Kansas and New Hampshire, which in itself might be a worthy trade-off. Every solution is going to create its own problems. I would say that one of the realities that you always hear people say is, well, yes, I mean, if you look at some of these states, they're giant red swaths with little blue dots, like you're ignoring all these red people. To which the answer is yes, but all of the blue people left all those red areas and they live in blue areas. So there are more of them. Right? This is what I mean, but there's no factual answer.
But
That it's necessarily those.
it's evolved so much from when that was set up.
So is it really necessary to be on the ground in every place?
Well, to which my answer would be, I don't know.
You could
I have the great privilege of not being relevant to policy discussions, right? No one's asking me, and I'm grateful for that. At this point, it's a weird vestige of a previous era without a clear successor. I think is kind of where we are then. And I definitely would be happy to talk about it. I do want to make sure that we're remembering. So what's the undertow here in terms of where that leaves us as individuals? Like, obviously, one of the answers to that question is getting indignant about things in a really productive way and giving voice to our own ethical commitment. One of the paradoxes throughout this is really important to remember. And there are veins of it in Federalists, and there are veins of it in the Mayflower Compact, but it's this idea of two freedoms. I hinted at this before, but sort of a negative freedom and a positive freedom in a really sort of conceptual way. There's a big difference between saying that people are free from the interference of the government. They are free from the prying eyes of the surveillance. They are free from having soldiers bark in their homes. They are free from all those things. As opposed to, they are free to have healthcare. They are free to have education. They are free to live a dignified life. That is a tension that's always going to be there. In some sense, like, there's this high school level aphorism of how, freedom should be absolute until it becomes the freedom to infringe on someone else's rights, and then it stops. Which seems logically coherent, but practically substanceless, because there's no such thing as an actual, legitimate, substantive, and relevant freedom as an individual who lives in a society that doesn't in some way involve some sort of compromise or trade-off or engagement with someone else's. In a really simple way, right? Like, there's a helpful backyard metaphor here, right? Like, if you have neighbors that disagree, you're going to have to look at each other's yard. If I am irritated that my neighbor, I try not to be too personal, you don't, it's fine. If I'm irritated that my neighbors have Bermuda grass and underwater irrigation, because it's ridiculous, a waste, and I would like my geese to be happier, that's fine, that's democracy, I have no say. If they then want to put their dog on a chain and leave it outside and bark, depending on where I live, I might be able to go join the city council and pass an ordinance that does that. If they leave the dog out there and neglect, I can call animal control. If they are arguing with their spouse in an annoying way, I can feel really comfortable being judgmental, but I don't have any legal recourse. If they hit their spouse, I can call the cops. So obviously there's a threshold here of ways in which we are tolerating the people with whom we are sharing the world. And we've established some legal parameters around which what no longer counts as toleration and is just like a question of legality and illegality.
Well, that's another responsibility of citizenship, is following the laws, and or say, not infringing on other people's rights. And the laws guide us to do that.
Yeah, because one of the things that I thought when you said, responsibility to stay current or to know what's happening and why, and to look at various sides of the issue, it reminded me of a couple of years ago when there was riots going on in cities and people were burning flags, and I said, and Bob said, that is a First Amendment right. That is their right to do that. Now, is it their right to damage somebody's business or to hurt somebody? That's when the police get called in, I guess. But it's well within their right to denigrate a flag, if they want to.
Unless it stimulates somebody, some kind of riot.
Right.
Yeah, but how do you
But
determine?
that's the current interpretation of it.
But how do you determine that?
Exactly.
So So which gets back to the complicated issue of rights versus,
But they can't burn your flag. They can burn their flag. They can't.
Did you
Yeah,
guys?
I had a question, something you raised last week with the Federalists, and maybe one. You raised the issue of something that I never thought about before, that each of those, when they're being drafted, they had a group of presuppositions they brought to them that we needed to understand. And that's where my concern is now is how are our presuppositions for each of us being transformed because of high tech and the media? But I think we need to look at, or how am I being changed? My presuppositions are being transformed, unconsciously because of what's happening through the media.
or are their presuppositions relevant?
Are they relevant to today? Yeah, the ones I had 20 years ago may not be relevant.
Well, I think this goes back to
Yeah.
but it's not just voting, it's doing the work. Right, it's the doing the thinking, it's
Yeah.
contributing the thought, the critical thinking, yeah. And I think that would be, I mean, we're a self-selecting group, right, we're all here. Intellectual citizenship is pretty high on a lot of people's priorities.
Yes, just something about the obligation of citizenship. I mean, I understand what you mean in the colloquial matter, we all have certain things we think are those that make us a good citizen. But there's really no obligation to be a U.S. citizen. Right? You just become a U.S. citizen when you're born. You don't never have to vote. You have to pay taxes and follow the law. But other than that, is there any sort of fixed obligation?
Well, so no, but I would say that to that, it's worth asking yourself, and we all have different ways of navigating this, but whether your own ethical and moral commitments are more powerful obligations than legal expectations. I mean, I break speed limit and parking laws all the time.
That's for yours.
You are being reported.
Oh, okay. And I have a long form birth certificate, so I'm safe.
You just take a chance that you don't get caught.
But there are other things about which I am pedantically deferential, and game laws are an example of that because I care a lot about wildlife conservation, and I hunt and I fish, and I get irritated when I see other people violate bag limit laws or possession limits. And that is a bigger driver for me than the fear of getting caught or punished otherwise. And so I would ask if, because I think that, legal sense, no, like there's very little, I guess jury duty might be the most obvious example of like you can get punished if you don't do it right. But by obligation, it's the question of what's important to us. So at the end of the day, it's not about avoiding punishment. It's about feeling good about what we think we should do.
Where do values and citizenship intersect? I'm thinking of a couple of examples. Let's take Kearney, Nebraska, the county in the middle of the country, as opposed to Brooklyn, New York. Do they share the same values? What about getting back to what Harold said just a little while ago about, nationalism as opposed to maybe globalism? Who might say that Viktor Orban's values are better or worse than Klaus Schwab?
So you have framed it, I think, quite well. In some sense, that's the crux of it. It's a big, complicated country. It goes without saying there's a lot of different values. That's what politics is engaging with people, not understanding why what they think is good is not what you think is good. When you don't have recourse, remember, evil and stupid are off the table, right? That's what this is about. I mean, in some sense, it's useful to remember democracy. Think of democracy less as some sort of utopian way in which we are all creating perfect belonging, and more as a social peace treaty, where instead of letting things escalate, we have agreed historically that in order to be able to continue participating the way we want to, we will let other people participate in the system, and we'll lose once in a while, but we won't kill each other. Democracy is a peace treaty as much as anything else. And one of the paradoxes that we're talking about here The shorthand for the intellectual history of it is this underlying tension between classic liberal ideals of thought, transparency, engagement, openness, inclusivity, parliamentarism. So in order to have a good governing discussion, everybody can come talk. It's an open forum. On the one hand, and democracy, it needs to, the crazy part to rule things. The people are ruling, the word group, is to make decisions. And there's an underlying challenge there where liberalism ostensibly leaves room for plural commitments and ethical ideals, and you can believe whatever you want. Here's the rule. Here are the rules. Just follow these rules, and everybody can have their own definition of what's good. In order to have that, you need to have open access and everybody can participate. To have a democracy, you need to know who the demos is. And you end up needing citizenship rules about who gets to count in this country. Historically, we've had very expansive ones. In order to do the actual ruling, you can't just talk all the time. So you end up with this volatile scenario of liberal ideals of a parliament or a House of Representatives of debating ideals that can't act and that is rendered unstable and incapacitated. And on the Democratic side, you have the ability to actually pursue ideals and say, yes, this is what we care about. It's the liberals who say, I don't care what you care about as long as I get to care about what I care about. And then what we're going to protect is the negative rights. I won't invade your backyard. I will not burn your flag. I will not personal property. And it's the Democrats who say, I care about you having native plants, and I care about you being nonviolent toward your children, and I care about these things. And we spend a lot of time in this country, and you can see in all these texts, and it's a big part of what we're talking about. It's hard to know sometimes. Is this me saying, I'm going to do my thing and you do your thing, and let's just leave ourselves alone? Because there's no room in that system for ideals of human dignity. That is, everyone has the right to starve to death in an unheated home in an economically unjust world where there's no health care. And it's the more substantive, everyone has a right to health care, a right to education, a right to this. But by everyone, necessarily mean these people, not these people. Now, it's not necessarily an incompatibility, but I think it's a pretty compelling argument that you can tip a little bit too far in either of those directions and end up with nobody being happy about the outcome. So a lot of what we're talking about here is that question of values. To what extent should the government care about values? That's the sort of underlying question here. That's the corollary question. If you're thinking about, well, here's what my citizenship means to me, and here's what I've obligated myself to care about and do as it follows that definition that I have for myself of my own citizenship. The other side of that is, how much does government get involved? I don't
think that was a good example of right.
Which one?
What you just said about the right to live in poverty, basically. I think that's a good one.
Oh, I mean, that's very interesting, but I could find you.
I think Santorum would be a better thing. Or, who you love and who you want to partner with.
I was exaggerating for comic effect, and it's not mean to say that I was embracing that, but that is the logical outcome of an extreme interpretation of what Ron Paul used to say every 4 years.
I would agree with that. There are some homeless people that don't want to be taken off the street. They don't want that or taken to a shelter.
Yeah. But that's okay, but there may be, people might argue that that's part of a mental issue as well.
Not always.
Well, I'm sorry, I was just saying, and I was offering it up not as a right to that someone necessarily that they would ask it, although empirically, yes, that is sometimes the case. If in fact, this goes back to what it means for government to be silent on what its individuals are and are not entitled and obligated to do. If nowhere in the Constitution does it say that you have a right to food security or housing security or healthcare security, because our rules were written by a government that says they're written by people who more or less were saying, we'll talk about what government can't do, not about what people can do. And that's the nexus I was talking about. So if I have, this is the negative freedom, right? Like, I don't have a right, I guess in one model, I, as the, some sort of benevolent dictator, I would not be in that situation of selling someone that they were required to buy a particular kind of car, they were required to see a particular doctor. They have a right to see whomever they want. Functionally, we don't recognize in modern capitalism, if they don't have the money, they're not going, so that's not a substitute. But that was the contrast I was trying to illustrate. Am I clarifying it?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, but it gets iffy. I mean, when you have a family that says, well, we have the right to live without adequate food and without sending our kids to school, and then to me, it is their right, but it's
iffy. I mean, the politics is iffy. Like precisely it.
but it can also be viewed as child abuse.
Well, I like what you mentioned though, that it's the difference between what the government should be enforcing versus what individuals can choose. For an example,
Vaccines is right in there,
yeah.
Do you have to vaccine your kid or
Or
can
do
you choose not to?
your children have to go to school? I have a niece who was working with the VA in San Francisco to get veterans into homes, to provide shelter. They would not do it because their team was there on the street. So they had to come up with an idea where they would bring people in, they would have like a 4-bedroom kind of a home or something like that, so everyone could be there together. So it was an interesting way of comparing what people wanted and the government having to come up with a solution that met their needs. But
I could spin this just a little bit. So Justice Ginsburg gave a speech in Johannesburg several decades ago about the Bill of Rights in South Africa. There are 27 articles in it. One of them would be the right to clean water or to adequate housing. And so I think at some point, government can only do so much, and natural law takes care of humanity in some ways. If you take a look at how those 27 articles of the Bill of Rights are going in South Africa, you would have to ask yourself, how's this working out for the people in the townships of South Africa? The fact is, it hasn't worked out so well. So I think I'm not sure how to answer that question. And I don't think that Justice Ginsburg did either, other than saying this is right and noble, but how's it really working out on a practical level?
what would Justice Ginsburg say about how things are working out in the United States?
Not smart enough to do the question.
We're talking about individual rights. What about, the rights of society? For instance, if I have a right to throw my garbage out the window on the street.
Like they used to do in New York.
Of course, that was
Normal.
yeah, expected. Okay, that might be my right to do that, but it's not society's right to have to live with my garbage sitting on the street. There's something about societal rights that in some cases supersede the individual right.
Yes, I agree. I think that there's yet another layer here. The reason I raise all this is because these are exactly the sorts of conversations that, congratulations, you all get to continue having in your heads, right? These are not resolvable. There's literally not even a Supreme Court anymore that has the credibility to say, no, we solved it, right? That's not the way this works. Politics is not about resolution, it's about disagreement. And it's ostensibly about disagreement without violence. I would add to this yet another layer. What about group rights? We talk about this a lot in terms of indigenous rights. So, we have languages that are spoken by very few people in this world. And it's easy to say that a person has a right to speak their own heritage language if you focus on the individual. Well, if you don't compel the other people in that town to take the same language, there's no one to talk to.
But who does that impact? It doesn't impact the whole town. It only impacts that individual that has no.
But that's what we're saying. But that's basically saying that person has no right. I mean, like, any one of us could make up a language of which we are the only speaker. We don't actually have substantive enjoyment of that right if there's no one with whom to converse. So it's another trade-off. Like, these are all trade-offs that are much more complicated than saying I have unlimited freedom until I start infringing on someone else's.
So this is just a way of showing us how much difficulty there must have been to create the Constitution, right?
Well, and I think that one of the points that I encourage us all to take from the last night today is that we're all busy remaking the Constitution all the time. Anyway, the Constitution is a text that gets modified sometimes, right? But it also has weight and matters because the way it's interpreted and the way that it's put in place and the way that we as citizens understand ourselves to be part of the country that it at least nominally governs. Conversations like this are part of that. And I would suggest that this is exactly the sort of critical thinking intellectual citizenship to which it is part of what Jackie was referring, which is that it's rarely satisfying to have a conversation that ends with more uncertainty than it began. Unless you get enough practice at it and recognize that what feels like certainty and resolution in politics is almost always a lie.
Well, it's
You
also.
can't be an impatient person who is societally engaged. You have to the ability to sustain yourself on the basis of questions.
Express yourself. Well, it gets back to one of the things that Jackie commented on earlier, that building a sense of community means being able to get into groups like this and share ideas. Sometimes the best ideas come out of arguments, right? Because somewhere along the line, somebody who knows more than you about the subject tells you something that's a fact, and you go, "Oh, I hadn't thought that." And then eventually you start moving over in that direction. But I think that's a big part of building a sense of community and a community, say, like Easton. Did you guys know that you can go to an Easton Town Council meeting and air your grievance?
If you could do it in 3 minutes.
Yes, they will. But they
If you
will.
can't do it in 3 minutes.
They cut you off.
They cut you off.
Or you could bring the whole group of
I've been
people.
to that.
Yeah.
Or I was compelled to come before it. So, thing by a request for a variance and have an addition, as they come for them to make my case.
Watched town council meetings and I've also watched the what do you call them, the ones where they're talking about Huh? No, the ones where they're meeting with a group of people who are talking about
Portions.
Focus groups.
no. The ones a meeting and you go and that's their job is to come up with a plan. But I'm always amazed that all it takes is a couple people to make a comment negative to maybe someone who's wanting to build 50 homes. And all of a sudden, they're going back, they're rethinking it, and they come back the next month with some other idea. And that's because people are participating. So not so much when you have to go and, you have a big gripe, but when you're there to listen and jump in and voice your thoughts.
When they actually do this. It's when they don't.
How can we apply to what we learned Robert Kennedy's.
Oh, thanks, Bob. We can move on.
We're already talking about all the things. So here's what I would say. It's on page, if you go to the first full paragraph on the page, it's page 3 of 9. It's the footer says, which is this is the packet. It's a paragraph that says it is at a root, the root of all of it, the national soul of the United States. But this speech is an encapsulation of a pretty strong footprint on one side of what we're talking about. It's very much we know who we are. Government is here to engage in question, not just of what the rules are, but what is good. This is very much a what is good speech. So he's talking about, the malaise, spirit, discouraging, initiative, paralyzing will and action divided. It's 1968, right? So we've already had the two assassinations at this point, 6 weeks before its own. The Tet Offensive is about 6 weeks prior. There's a lot going on, needless to say. But if you go to, so the couple below that, all around us, not just on the question of Vietnam, not just on the question of the cities, not just the question of poverty, the problems of race relations, all around us, why you are so concerned and why you are so disturbed. The fact is that men have lost confidence in themselves, in each other. And he says later on, so that we confront our fellow citizens across impossible barriers of hostility and mistrust. And again, I don't believe that we have to accept that. So, I think that this is basically saying this isn't policy problems anymore. This is us having walked the thread on what we're doing. What is the content that our government and our people are supposed to be doing? And I think he does a pretty good job of, the motif here is the other America, talking about childhood hunger, talking about out of work minors, out of northern Appalachia. He's talking about who the we are, and he's giving it substance. He's forcefully, and I think quite intentionally, saying we do have shared purpose and shared goals here. And I think that's one of the things that's, in some sense, most quaint about this. Because that's a harder sell now than it probably was 60 years ago. He uses the word dignity. So the next page, 4 out of 9, he said, this is one of the great tasks for us, is the last paragraph, as individuals and citizens this year. But even if we act to erase material poverty, there's another greater task. It's to confront the poverty of satisfaction, of purpose and dignity that afflicts us all. So this question of dignity, in some sense, this is a useful paraphrase. What is the government's role in dignity? It goes back to the kind of sardonically paraphrasing the argument that people would have a right to starve. Apologies again for that, it's misunderstood. But this is a question of government's relation to dignity. This is unanswered, the question of what should government care about? Say that matters. Yes. What happens when we don't agree on what dignity is like? And that's politics. Because one answer to saying we don't all agree on dignity is to say, okay, everyone's on their own to choose what dignity looks like. And then fewer people have it.
We're likely moving into a period of time of artificial intelligence where there could be even a wider dispersion of income. Where some people are going to get extraordinarily wealthy and some people are going to lose their jobs. And that's going to suffer. So as that happens, what will the government's role be in helping solve that unbalance? Because it can get very dramatic in a fairly short order of time.
I expected an answer.
Because I got people, and I've got some of my friends say, well, the rich are just going to get super rich and the poor are going to get way poor. Like, well, what's the role of government? I don't know. They never seem to be able to resolve anything. So we're going to see a lot of dystopians going forward. And other people are saying it could lead to more healthcare, more this, more that. The better. society. I'm just throwing it out there because I do have these conversations with people and it seems to relate to what we're talking about. You know, what is the role of citizens? What kind of country do we want? What kind of priorities do we have? And it's just something that's actually around the corner. It's not that far out.
So we could scale that up a little bit, because I think it's a really useful question. We could scale it to slightly more general context, which is the sense of, for some people, foreboding. For some people, maybe it's just a more mild form of anxiety, but uncertainty about what's happening next, with what looks an awful lot like a decent chance of it being bad for a lot of our fellow citizens, in some sense. What is that? Each of us, right, thinking for ourselves, looking ahead to that. If in 10 years we're anticipating a possible future 10 years from now in which we have, double-digit unemployment, probably double-digit interest rates,
Probably double-digit GDP growth.
right?
So some people are getting, I mean,
So what does that mean? Like, what does that mean about us? Because the dejection and desperation are.
more GDP, more growth, more wealth, and yet a large number of people without anything. Because it's a dichotomy, right? I mean, what do you do with that increased wealth? You just put it into more yachts, more giant mansions, or is it get redistributed to people that are starving?
So I think it's
It's a value thing again.
and it's an important question, and I think that the conventional way to answer that question for a lot of people is to think about policy, the government should do. And I want us here to be thinking about, okay, fine, but we're not in charge of the government, we're citizens. One of the problems that a lot of us encounter and find very frustrating as citizens is that binary, saying the government doesn't care, I don't live in a state where my vote counts, I don't have a say in that, therefore I'm going to do nothing over here. Which empirically is probably most offensive ways, honestly, right? But that's not why we're here, right? If you're a person who cares about citizenship, it's worth thinking hard about, okay, what, and it's not, I should write more letters to the editor and I should get involved and I should demonstrate. For some people, that is the answer. And that's where the drive is. What I'm hoping, what I think everyone is thinking more about their expectations for themselves as a citizen, as a member of this community, not just a citizen of the federal government, as a citizen of Eastern Maryland, as a citizen of our workplace, as a citizen of this seminar. And what are the obligations and commissions and prohibitions that accrue to our status as a member of each of those different assemblages of people?
Partly with this and partly going back to something we said earlier that's really bothering me. And it said, well, if you choose to live in an unheated house without indoor plumbing and I know there are people who choose to be a homeless, but if you take out all the mentally ill, there's not too many.
Listen, mentally ill is 31% of homeless. That's still a large population that may or may not, and also people who are mentally ill may choose to be homeless because they don't want to be on meth, they don't want to be in an institution.
Right.
So you have to think of that side. They have rights too.
Indeed. But what I'm thinking is the ones who are not choosing to be food insecure and housing insecure, they're there because they didn't have any other option.
Yeah, like Indian populations in the Dakotas or whatever.
Yes, and there are plenty of those who are not choosing to live like that. It's best they can do. And I do think that those are the responsibility of the rest of us, of society, to give them some relief. I'm not talking about.
No, I think some people honestly are one now, but some people that is a lifestyle. I know some people that's what they choose. They
Yes.
just live out of their car, you
No,
know?
it wasn't that many generations ago that our parents had to go outside to go to the bathroom. So,
There's still the old outhouse here behind my house. I have an old house, and
yeah, so
it's still there.
keeping up with the times is not a definition of citizenship.
So I have another question for you about citizenship, but one of the problems I have with where we are now is that I feel that our legislators and elected officials are not being good citizens. They're not following the laws and the requirements of their job. So, is that something we can talk about, or is that off the table?
I don't want anything to be off the table. I just want to make sure we're getting as much out of our time together. I think that what's interesting, one of the interesting things there is that I would suggest there will always be some part of citizenship when we ask ourselves, like, what's the ingredient list for my citizenship? Well, some component of that, in modern society, certainly in this country, that is going to entail frustration, happiness, dejection, abhorrence, disgust. And I think that it's untenable to think that you're going to get rid of that. I think that I would suggest that can be part of the mix. And in fact, it informs to some extent, the rest of the mix, right? So, a lot of us have learned a lot in the last 10 years about how government does and doesn't work. And we spent a lot of the last 10 years unlearning most of the rest of our lives about what government is. That can be true at the same time that we are deciding whether or not, as a citizen, we want to be retreating from society. And I started by saying, I think retreating from society, basically saying, I'm not engaged in any of this. That is a logical and defensible move for a lot of people. So I would encourage anyone not to think, and I might be reading too much into the thing, but I think there's a sense of powerlessness that can come from focusing too much of citizenship on a faraway federal government that for us is not that far away, but an abstraction of immutable power to which we are largely irrelevant.
Well, is it less abstract to think of citizenship in a community form?
And this is exactly my argument, which is that I think that anytime we're thinking about this, we should think about it at multiple levels, in multiple tiers, in multiple contexts, and to not let the sense of desperation that can accrue to some of those experiences pollute the rest of it and shut down the other avenues by which we are engaging the world around us. And yeah, some other relevant, interesting questions to be had around what you raised, but that's what I would say in terms of citizenship. If we have to think of it as a sort of multimodal, multi-contextualized, vague sort of morass sometimes of what it means to be sharing the world with people that are not ourselves.
I'd like to add some context to that. When I read the Moynihan piece, on one of the pages about road flat, right, acta non verba. And I think too often what we see with central government is that they talk too much, but they never do anything about it. You see that today. And I think on a local level, in terms of citizenship, I'll take one example. I saw a disparity between the opportunities that are afforded to kids on the Western Shore as opposed to what's happening here on the Eastern Shore. So instead of bitching about it, I did something about it. Right? And so these days, we're now in ending one decade of providing a leadership laboratory for high school kids who teach elementary school kids who are underprivileged. And so we're sending kids to all kinds of opportunities, whether it's trade schools or tier 1 universities. My goal as a mission officer for the Naval Academy is to find that one gem over here that we can send to West Point or Naval Academy and that sort of thing. So I think we have an obligation as citizens is not to complain about stuff, but do stuff.
Yeah,
We don't do enough of that. If you think about the conversations we had so often, it's so easy to complain. Instead of saying, okay, what's the problem? What are the possible solutions? Let's pick a best solution. Let's give it a try and measure how it's doing. And we don't do that. Again, I think as a society, we've kind of deteriorated to a point of bellyachers and work whiners and chirpers. Enough of my rant.
There's also power. And what's happened, my observation is that the power is being executed in every corner of every department of our government, whether it's to the letter of the law or not. In many cases, the law itself has left so many cracks open to exercise power that we didn't think people would exercise it, except in extraordinary situations, that is now being exercised. And that's affecting the national government, state government, the local governments, all the way down. So power is being executed, I think, in a way that hasn't been in the past, let's put it that way. And that's affecting us locally.
Well, I would, I guess,
We have a bridge that's going up that, they got knocked down in Baltimore. Is the federal government going to be providing funds for that, or is somebody going to say something to upset somebody else, and all of a sudden the funds disappear? We have to go to court to get it back.
We're gonna be punished because we
Because,
go one way versus.
because of what you've said and what your political leanings are, that's, I mean, maybe it's defensible legally, but it certainly is an exercise of power that it's in best.
well, I would, in substance to both of us, somewhat in defense of the whining and chirping. Well, those, if we think about citizenship as an experience of having to share, of what it means to share the world, and the different ways in which we interact with different groups. Logical things that will happen suggested is being able to share confusion as much as to share knowledge and to share experiences and to benefit ourselves by learning from other people who've encountered maybe similar things and handled it differently. Just to learn more generally and to exchange that recognition by hearing from other people and give them that sense of relationship. So I would suggest that you can't, I'm kind of out of a thing here, so it warrants more thought, but I would suggest that it's practically impossible to think about citizenship without thinking about relationships, that it's impossible to think about relationships without thinking about citizenship. Cannot have one without the other. And that to the extent that a lot of capital C go to the voting booth, register your car at the motor vehicles office, and sort of sure to give you citizenship stuff, to the extent that that can be alienating and feel like it's governed and defined primarily by disempowerment. It's also the space in which happens with relationships is where we get to learn things and make sense of our own ideas, decide what's important to us, and have a sense of impact over how to navigate those realities. And that you're probably going to have both the disempowerment and the empowerment, because whether we like it or not, unless we're moving out into the woods, we're going to have a relationship with the government. We might as well have relationships with other humans around us, and derive a bit more, meaning and stability and continuity and application. Would be
So
my-
is that the key takeaway that you want us to have of your program? What's the key takeaway? We want to know. I'm serious.
I think that the takeaway, my ideal takeaway is that everyone, not just you, literally everyone, but you, would have occasion to think about what's important to you. And to challenge yourself on that and either update it to something that you're comfortable believing or feel affirmed because you were right. And if it's right for you, think about what that entails for your obligations to the world. And proceed on that basis. So it's possible that someone does all that, I think, and that their understanding what it means to be a citizen is to vote and then never, ever, ever talk about religion, politics, or money ever again with anyone. And if that's what works for them, I feel like that is an important act of self-determination. I doubt that that's what actually is going to happen. So, I think I'm probably tilting the scale, But no, I think that the question, it's not so much that people are doing a particular thing, it's that they are the ones deciding what the right thing is.
That's a good way to finish it, I think. I would suggest though that, because we're older and we look back at things and many of us are retired and, more thoughtful and reading more and things like that. Because I remember when I was younger and busy, work. I don't remember ever really thinking much about what was going on around me, other than what I saw on the TV news or read in the paper in the morning before my coffee. And then I think citizenship maybe comes with age or comes with an issue that inflames our sensibilities and we want to get involved in it.
So I sense you'd like to respond.
I want to follow up on that just a little bit too. I think that, what are we doing? First of all, are we having this kind of conversation around the dinner table with our kids and grandkids? Are these kinds of conversations happening in the schools that we send our children to, our grandchildren to? I suggest, based on my own experience of working with a lot of high school kids here on the Delmarva Peninsula, that's not happening. So how are we creating a sense of citizenship with our youngest generations? Or are we just letting this go on autopilot, hoping
And hoping that
that
Instagram
So
does
it's
it.
not a strategy?
So I would say that I have no quarrel with your point there, other than to say that I think that there are other things that fit within the realm of citizenship beyond
Well, and I
that
think,
description.
and I
And
like what Bob was saying, that we do have a responsibility to engage our younger generation.
yeah, and I would, yeah,
Also, the elderly are marginalized in our society. And I think, because the families are scattered, as elderly person, just taking on a few people we can invest our lives in, or whether it's a young person, somebody with emotional needs or other people, and be there for them. And I think that's part of citizenship. But if you withdraw, then you become part of the problem too, and marginalize yourself. That's one of the things I moved here from Santa Barbara. One of the was where I work. Moving here, I've seen more opportunities to have dialogue than any place I've ever been.
And volunteer too.
And volunteers
Yeah.
because of this program.
Yeah.
I was blown away by it. This place I can talk, meet people, and we catch up on those issues like we did this morning.
By the way, I'm starting some discussions with Chesapeake College in the sociology department to get some discussions going between people in Chesapeake Forum and youth that are going through their college programs, which I think might be really interesting. So we have to figure out how we can manage it, make it happen.
Sort of like a mentorship?
No,
You're thinking,
it's just like taking classes together.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
And then don't rate one cuckoo flew over the cuckoo's nest.
Very cool. I hear. I would say that in another perspective on sort of something that I think would be good for each of you to have going forth, at least for regional hours. Another perspective on that would be that we're all doing citizenship all the time anyway. Some of us are doing it really badly, and we're falling short of our own expectations, let alone other people's expectations of our own. And because you don't have, there's no opt-out option. The least we could do is think about what that entails. And be a good person with whom to have to share a world that can be pretty shitty sometimes, as opposed to being resigned to the shortcomings of that space. I think that in some sense, the takeaway is that you can't get away from politics. You're not going to get away from the citizenship. We're all sharing the space. Anyway.
With my 81 years on this earth, the thing that I've come to the realization, particularly in the United States, because we're so focused on individualism and the importance of individualism, we forget the fact that as primates, we can't exist as an individual. We are part of a society. And society enables us to live. And I think too often we forget that we've got an obligation to that society. Yes, we have a right to live as individuals, and we all want to do that. But you've got to be willing to compromise to also support the society. Because society, you don't exist without the society. You can't exist. You need other people to exist.
You can't live without compromise.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And I think a lot of people forget that it's all about me. That's what's most important is me. And they forget about their obligation to society, and society's obligation to them. Because otherwise we can't exist.
I agree with what you're saying, but I think there's a hierarchy in society based on
Well, you
gender, race,
what that's going to look like.
nationality.
Yeah, what culture you're from defines. Sometimes the group is, in some cultures, the group is the most important thing. In their culture, it's more important. So those are the compromises.
So there are a couple of you that we haven't heard much from. What are your thoughts?
I'm blown away by this. I really am. I came out of the last meeting. I jumped into my wife's car. She says, "What do you think?" It's the most amazing thing I have done in I don't know how many years. This place is amazing. I've been here now 5 years. Came down from New Jersey, up or down. We spend a lot of time in Boca. And I just am, I'm amazed. We all have children way beyond. And I see kids who are not kids anymore, still struggling with where are they going? What are they doing? How are they going to do? Some kids are doing very well. Others are still trying to figure out, walking around, puttering around and saying, 34 years old, what the hell am I doing now?
At startups.
And well, I find this fascinating. I really do. Everything you folks have said, it just really gets, really does. your mention about this naval thing, having been a sometime sailor when I was in the Navy. And I always keep my ear, glued to things like that because I'm really interested in it. But I also heard you say something about you being the political independent?
I'm a libertarian.
A libertarian. So a libertarian, and I love libertarian stuff. I don't know what the hell I am, except I know that I get very angry when my son says to me, you're a socialist something or other, and I want to throw a rock at the kid. I'm too busy being a someone who goes into ambulances and saves people's lives. And,
We're the two Bobs, and we're the only two lefties in this group.
So what about from this side of the room? What were your thoughts?
Or do you disagree with anything that's been said? We have an obligation, society has an obligation to us. That we just have to manage our relationships.
I think we're having a lot of difficulty as a society in this part of the country. And shows up in schools, shows up in business, shows up in medical facilities. And there are talking sessions like this occurring. I don't know that they're more and more and more, but I think people are starting to recognize that something needs to be done here without taking an attitude like the Gestapo, that, do what I tell you, kind of thing. That's a delicate balance right there in every family. And we just don't know yet what the results are going to be politically in the country and what's all that position with the teenagers, 18, 20, 22, going off to college, a lot of, and is there going to be a future?
Is there
No money in college.
Right. College has gotten so much more expensive. It's unbelievable how expensive it's become. Yes. Well, thank you. And thank you thank you all of you and for Justin for leading us through this. Thank you. Thank you.